Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington. In this bulletin, we'll get you a roundup of stories developing all over the world. First up, the day's top headlines.
I don't see any danger of the imminent war in Ukraine.
Speaking exclusively to WION, the Ukrainian ambassador to India, Igor Polika, says that there is no imminent risk of war on Europe's eastern flank. During talks in Vienna, Russia says it will insist that NATO publicly announces that it will not admit Ukraine into the Western alliance. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says if President Putin approves the Russian parliament's authorization to recognize the Donbass as independent, it would amount to Russia rejecting the Minsk Accords and would necessitate a swift and firm response from the US and its allies. Poland slams a top EU court for allowing Brussels to slash its funding over the country's slide in democratic values. Warsaw says the ruling is an attack on Polish sovereignty. And in a landmark deal, families of victims of the Sandy Hook school shooting in the United States reach a $73 million settlement with gun manufacturer Remington. It's the first time a gun maker has been held liable for a mass shooting in the U.S. And we begin where else with Ukraine. For months now, leaders of the West, the United States and Russia have been embroiled in a war of words with threats, counter-threats, provocations and diplomacy over Ukraine. While fears of a possible Russian invasion have been mounting, with the West and the United States in particular raising the alarm, Moscow claims it is withdrawing some of its troops from the country's border with Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry says some units are returning to their bases, and earlier today, Russia also announced it has ended its military drills in Crimea, and that its soldiers there were returning to their garrisons. Russia's state television broadcast images of military units crossing a bridge linking the Russian-controlled peninsula of Crimea to the mainland. Moscow did not say how many units were pulling back. The deployment of some 130,000 Russian troops to the north, east and south of Ukraine has triggered alarms in Western capitals, fearful that a military operation could be imminent. And international powers are reacting cautiously to Russia's recent claims of a de-escalation in the tensions. The United States and its NATO allies remain unimpressed and unconvinced. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying within the last hour that in fact Russian mobilization is still building on the border, not de-escalating. In a speech last night, US President Joe Biden said danger is still clear and present.
Reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border.
President Biden appealed to Russian President Vladimir Putin to step back from waging war on Ukraine, saying it would cause needless death and destruction. Biden added that a Russian invasion is still very much a possibility, but he said there is room for more diplomacy.
The United States is prepared no matter what happens. We are ready with diplomacy, to be engaged in diplomacy with Russia. and our allies and partners to improve stability and security in Europe as a whole, and we are ready to respond decisively to Russian attack on Ukraine, which is still very much a possibility. Yesterday, the Russian government publicly proposed to continue the diplomacy. I agree. We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed.
NATO defence ministers are holding a crucial meeting in Brussels where NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has said he wants to see stronger signals of rapprochement.
NATO defence ministers will meet today and tomorrow, facing critical challenges for European security, and we have heard the signs from Moscow about readiness to continue diplomatic efforts. Okay. But so far, we have not seen any de-escalation on the ground. On the contrary, it appears that Russia continues the military build-up.
Ukraine is a sovereign country. It is making its own choices about its own future. But the Kremlin doesn't like this. And so it threatens war. And this is the essence of the current escalation. This is something we simply cannot accept. I think diplomacy has not yet spoken its last words, and we saw signs of hope yesterday. But now deeds have to follow those words.
What we haven't seen is evidence of withdrawal that has been claimed by the Kremlin. In fact, we've seen continued build-up of things like field hospitals and strategic weapon systems such as Iskander missiles deployed. So I think the reality is, I said last week when I visited Moscow, is that we'll take Russia at its word, but we'll judge them on their actions.
So lots going on today, and for the very latest, let's cross live to WION's Rosie Burchard, who joins us from Brussels. And Rosie, with Jens Stoltenberg and others in NATO saying that they don't see a de-escalation on the ground by the Russians, despite the Kremlin's claims, what is the mood there? Are people increasingly anxious about where this is going to head?
The mood in Brussels is tense, and there certainly was a degree of scepticism on the way into this meeting. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said he had heard these overtures from Russia suggesting dialogue could continue, and he'd also heard this Russian announcement that troops may be moved back from near the border with Ukraine. But he said, as you mentioned, there was no sign, according to NATO, no sign of a concrete de-escalation on the ground. In fact, to the contrary, it looks like, according to NATO, that military build-up continues. However, he did also want to highlight that NATO remains ready for dialogue. He reiterated that NATO has sent Russia proposals back in January on areas that NATO thinks Russia and the alliance could better cooperate, or where they might be able to try and find some common ground. So, for example, greater coordination on arms control, or briefing each other on military exercises. There have been, according to NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg, no reply from Moscow yet on that. But still, with both sides saying they're open to dialogue, it seems that so far, despite these really flaming tensions, that diplomatic path, those diplomatic talks have not yet run dry.
And Rosie, there's been a substantial cyber assault on Ukraine over the course of the last few hours, targeting major government departments, including the Defence Ministry in Kiev. The Russians have denied having anything to do with it. But does NATO view that cyber assault in and of itself as part of Russia's escalation that they're talking about?
Well, Simon, we haven't heard specifically on NATO about this yet. That's something we'll be listening out for very closely throughout the day. That maybe, we can imagine that is coming up in these talks between ministers. But we know that NATO has in the past condemned cyber attacks, and certainly in off-the-record briefings that I've been to, I've heard from both the European Union and NATO side that they are monitoring and preparing for types of aggression which might be beyond a simple, or might be beyond an invasion on the ground. So something that NATO and, of course, us as journalists here in Brussels are monitoring very carefully.
And, of course, the US has warned that a cyber assault could be part of the kind of hybrid warfare they are claiming that Russia may wage on Ukraine. That's WION's Rosie Burchard live for us in Brussels today. Thanks very much indeed for that, Rosie. Let's move on now to unprecedented news from the United States. Families of 9 victims of the Sandy Hook school shooting have reached a $73 million settlement with US gun manufacturer Remington. It's a landmark deal. It comes at a time when the US is seeing a relentless rise in campus massacres and gun violence, and it is the first time a gun maker has ever been held responsible for a public shooting in the United States. The families sued Remington in 2014, a fight that was made more difficult due to a US law that protects gun makers from most lawsuits. The Remington payout will go to the families of 4 adults and 5 children who were killed in the shooting and will be made via the company's insurers.
Today marks an inflection point when our duty of care to our children as a society finally supersedes the bottom line of an industry that made such an atrocity as Sandy Hook possible to begin with. Today is a day of accountability for an industry that has thus far enjoyed operating with immunity and impunity.
Our legal system has given us some justice today. But as I told Josh Koskov a few weeks ago, David and I will never have true justice. True justice would be our 15-year-old, healthy and standing next to us right now. But Benny will never be 15.
They had the energy and drive and motivation to do one thing, and that was to do whatever they could so that other families, whether they are in a suburb or a township or a city, would not have to go through the kind of pain and loss that they had.
The lawsuit succeeded in the courts by focusing on Remington's marketing strategy. The victims' families argued that Remington knowingly marketed a military-grade weapon for civilian use. The case alleged that the AR-15 assault rifle is grossly unsuited to commercial sale. The lawsuit also claimed that the company marketed the weapon through video games, which the Sandy Hook shooter was known to have played. The plaintiffs also cited advertisements of high-capacity magazines that have military utility by the company, highlighting that the AR-15 has become the most used weapon in America's mass shootings.
An AR-15, a combat weapon. This is the AR-15 on the floor of the first grade classroom. Was used not by a highly trained soldier, but by a deeply troubled kid. Not on a battlefield abroad, but in an elementary school at home. And not to preserve freedoms, but to eviscerate them. I thought the case was really about the gun, but it's just as much about greed.
The shooting took place in 2012 at Sandy Hook Elementary School. 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot and killed 26 people at the Connecticut school. The victims included 20 children and 6 teachers, the second deadliest school massacre in American history. The gunman had developmental disabilities. His former classmates called him shy but unusually intelligent. The investigation revealed that Lanza was obsessed with mass murders in the run-up to the attack. His mother was a gun enthusiast who bought him an AR-15 more than 2 years before the shooting. Lanza murdered her before attacking the school, and then he killed himself. US President Joe Biden lauded the historic settlement, saying it will help ensure that gun manufacturers are held accountable, and adding that manufacturers must be part of the solution to the gun violence pandemic. Biden warned if companies fail to do so, then they will bear the financial brunt of their complicity. For more on all of this, let's cross now to WION's correspondent Susan Tehrani, who joins us live from New York. Susan, this is unprecedented, and it is the kind of accountability that Joe Biden has been demanding for gun manufacturers. But to what extent is this a one-off as opposed to a legal precedent?
You know, it's unprecedented in a way that it sort of breaks that mold against gun manufacturers. And here in the United States, sort of the gun lobby, the gun manufacturers, the NRA in general is perceived as sort of being this undefeated body, if you may. But, you know, prior to this settlement, some media reports suggested that if this settlement is reached, there will be some kind of a floodgates opening of legal lawsuits coming against gun manufacturers. But that may not be the case, and partially because of the rules and regulations that you mentioned earlier, known as the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which grants gun manufacturers immunity from lawsuits that arise out of the criminal misuse of a weapon. Now, this was an exception because the families, again, as you mentioned, said that the gun was misrepresented in one way or the other. It's very unlikely that case after case will be taken to the Supreme Court, and you know, it would pan out the way that it did. There are a lot of arguments here in the United States on whether or not guns kill people or people kill people. You know, then there's the Second Amendment issues, the right to bear arms. So yes, it's a very unprecedented. Those families, they were looking for some kind of justice. Any parent can understand that. You know, the horrific incident that happened and what the families are feeling right now is something that no one wants to feel. But to think that this will sort of open the gates for a floodgate of lawsuits, I think would be premature.
And Susan, it is worth reminding people that while President Biden continues to talk about the need for meaningful gun control in the United States, the political calculus on Capitol Hill, where legislation would need to be passed, has not changed. There is no groundswell favoring gun control in Congress.
Absolutely. And one of those reasons, again, because it is a hypersensitive and divided issue, not only in Congress, but among the American people. And Joe Biden knows this. He can do that when he's rallying to become president. But in a very divided Capitol Hill right now, and in 2022, when elections are coming up, you can mention it once or twice. But when the American people are voting, this is not a time to really look for gun reform, despite the fact that it's a Democratic talking point. It has been for years, but the Second Amendment issue and the gun issue is something that the American people are very passionate about on both sides of the aisle, and I don't think that he's going to be passing anything anytime soon.
And tragic though it is, there will be another mass shooting in the United States soon. It is inevitable. Susan Tehrani, WION's correspondent in New York, thanks very much indeed for that. Now, a standoff between the United States and Mexico over avocados is continuing. The US Department of Agriculture says that imports of new Mexican avocado pears will stay suspended for as long as necessary to ensure the safety of American inspectors who were threatened verbally in Mexico's avocado-rich Michoacan state. The decision to halt imports of Mexican avocados is now piling pressure on restaurants across the United States, already weary of pandemic restrictions and supply chain issues that have dogged them for the past 2 years.
The U.S. has suspended avocado imports from Mexico, leaving many restaurants scrambling to fill their orders. Piero Sanchez manages Baja Cantina in Los Angeles, where he says supplies may run out in 2 to 3 days.
So it's super concerning. The fact of the matter that the restaurant industry, we've been walloped with prices on everything. So the fact of the matter that there's now another thing that's going to affect us is just nonstop.
The incoming avocado scarcity is coming after an announcement by the U.S. Department of Agriculture on Monday. It said it would block imports after employees were verbally threatened in Mexico's western Michoacan state. The details of the incident weren't immediately clear, but Michoacan, which is Mexico's top avocado-producing state and the only one certified to export to the U.S., has long dealt with security issues linked to drug gangs. That marks another source of trade tension between Washington and Mexico City and spells trouble for restaurant owners like Sanchez, who have grappled with pandemic restrictions and supply chain issues for the past 2 years.
Baja Cantina, we specialize on freshness on our food. So, avocados, we want to make sure we have enough to get us by. Realistically, we have enough for about 2 to 3 days until we start seeing our pricing kind of change. So for us, we'll find a viable solution. We'll find a substitute, or even that if we need to take a little bit of a hit, we'll take it. But we're hoping this crisis or this situation ends very soon. We can get more supply out here and give the restaurants a break.
The USDA says any crops which have been safety approved before February 11th could still be exported.
No avocado toast for me for breakfast this morning, but mercifully there is no shortage of American cream cheese. That is all we have on today's WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks. For more global news and updates, stay tuned always to WION. World is One.
Many other. This is right, Arab.